let's get started. So whenever I give a talk, I always like to at least introduce myself so you have a little bit of an idea about educational background, where I'm speaking from. So I'm a clinical physician, a practicing physician, that is, I see patients, but I'm also the chief medical officer for a biotech company, IsoThrive, and IsoThrive is a maker of prebiotic supplements. Well, I'll tell you more about that when we get into the talk. But my professional background, I graduated from Dartmouth College. From there, I went to Tufts University School of Medicine for a medical degree. I subsequently finished a family medicine residency where I'm board certified, and I hold fellowship status in both the American Academy of Family Physicians and the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine. And most of my career has been spent treating patients in the sphere of health, wellness, and nutrition. So let's go to next slide. Have some technical difficulties here. There we go. So topics we'll cover on this brief talk. Talk a little bit about probiotics versus prebiotics. That is, what are they? What's the difference? Also talk a little bit about how gut bacteria regulate health, and specifically the impact of prebiotics on healthful bacteria in the gut. Then we'll segue a little bit into foods and how they play a role in either creating or preventing inflammation through their prebiotic content. And then we'll talk a little bit about staying healthy in the holidays. So probiotics versus prebiotics. Probiotics are bacteria. And specifically, probiotics are those subsets of bacteria in the colon that have been linked to positive health outcomes in scientific studies. So it's not all bacteria in the colon, just a subset. Prebiotics, on the other hand, are the food molecules that those healthful bacteria eat. That is, that subset of bacteria are specialists in certain types of fiber, and by using that fiber, they can make themselves grow better and be more metabolically active, which has positive health consequences. Prebiotic foods, I'll talk more about, but you see some pictured here. The middle one is a Jerusalem artichoke, on the left is onions, and then fermented foods. Fermented vegetables also have prebiotic molecules in them. So let's start first with fiber, since I said that prebiotics were a type of fiber. There's basically an easy breakdown for fiber, and that is soluble versus insoluble. So insoluble first. Insoluble fiber, as the name implies, doesn't dissolve in water. You probably are familiar with a product called Metamucil or Psyllium, and those are classic examples of insoluble fiber. That is, if you mix a couple of spoonfuls into a glass of water and you stir it up, it doesn't dissolve, it just makes a slurry. An insoluble fiber is valuable in that it helps to hold water inside the colon, and so provides sort of a bulking agent to the stool. Otherwise, it really doesn't have any health properties. All the other health properties that people think of when they talk about fiber are from soluble fiber. So soluble fiber, segueing that direction, is fiber that does dissolve in water. That is, if you mix some of it into a glass of water, it would dissolve just like sugar or salt. And there's a specialized type of soluble fiber that has been shown in scientific studies to feed healthful bacteria. That's been termed a prebiotic. So prebiotic soluble fiber is what the majority of this talk will be about. So prebiotic soluble fiber, how does it work? That is, how does it improve your health? Well, you ingest fiber, that is, you ingest soluble fiber. Your gut bacteria then have the capacity to break it down. They then release short-chain fatty acids, primarily acetate, butyrate, and propionate. And those short-chain fatty acids do several things. One, short-chain fatty acids are the primary nutrient for the cells that line the colon. Without short-chain fatty acids, the lining of the colon doesn't have enough food and doesn't do as well. Number two, short-chain fatty acids, through nourishing those lining cells of the colon, help the body to produce communication molecules, things with weird names like PYY and GLP-1, leptin, and ghrelin. Won't go through all the biochemistry in this brief text, but suffice to say that those substances get into the bloodstream and then go throughout the body, to the liver, to the brain, and affect a wide variety of functions within the body, which I'll talk about. The other health effect of prebiotics is that when they feed healthful bacteria, those bacteria are more metabolically active, and a lot of them produce really natural antibiotics, if you want to call it that. And unlike the antibiotics that we physicians prescribe, which are very broad spectrum and kill a very wide swath of bacteria, the natural antibiotics that are produced by bacteria are specific for their competition. That is, they only kill their competition. They're trying to make more room for themselves to live. The good news is their competition also happens to include pathogens for humans. So they are, to a certain extent, helping keep down bad bacteria through their production of antibiotics naturally within the body. So the health effects. This is a little bit of a busy slide, and there are lots and lots of studies that is literally we could spend hours talking about this slide. So really just consider this a summary with lots of data behind it. So scientific studies have shown that prebiotics, through feeding bacteria, have a health regulatory effect in a number of areas. Specifically, studies have shown improved regulation of GI function with decreased constipation and or diarrhea, depending on the person. Improved regulation of the immune system, which can be both better fighting of infection as well as decreased inflammation and decreased allergic phenomena. There's a regulation of appetite that happens if you're overweight, which obviously can be helpful if you're trying to lose weight. There's also an improvement in lipids, which goes along with excess weight. Lipids, that's triglycerides and cholesterol. There's also an improvement in calcium and magnesium absorption and bone mineralization and bone strength. There's a decreased risk of a variety of cancers. There's growing evidence for improvements in mood, what's been termed the gut-brain axis, that is the gut talking to the brain and helping decrease depressive symptoms or anxiety symptoms. And then lastly, there's growing evidence for improvements in heartburn. So let's look at this from an evolutionary biology standpoint first. If you go back 10,000 plus years, that is before agriculture, we were hunter-gatherers. And so we hunted, ate whatever it was that we were able to procure that way, and then we weren't farming yet, so we were using things like digging sticks, the first technology developed by man, to dig into the earth to get root-type vegetables. Root-type vegetables are rich in probiotics. Modern versions of that are things like Jerusalem artichoke and chicory. That was the state-of-the-art for a million years, until about 10,000 years ago when agriculture began. And when agriculture began, several things happened. People stopped moving around. They got rooted in a location where their agriculture was. The root vegetables that were available, therefore, decreased because they don't grow quickly and a lot of them grow deeply underground. However, we started producing food above ground, wheat, vegetables, etc. We needed a way to preserve those foods as well, and so fermentation was discovered. So starting about 10,000 years ago, we ate more plant-based foods, and we fermented a lot of those foods. You can see in the slide the concept of wheat being turned into traditionally fermented sourdough bread, and cabbage being turned into sauerkraut, kimchi, and others. That was the state of the art from 10,000 years ago all the way through about 150 years ago. About 150 years ago, things changed. Why? Well, Pasteur told us bacteria are in all of these areas, and they can cause disease. And he invented pasteurization, which killed bacteria in foods. And then a little while later, we developed antibiotics and started killing bacteria widely, then hand sanitizers. That is, the last 150 years has been a war on bacteria, including bacteria that are healthful. Consequently, as fermented prebiotic fiber has disappeared, those fibers are missing in the food supply, at the same time that we have an attack or an onslaught on bacterial populations that are healthful. It's a double whammy. Let's look at it another way, still evolutionarily though. If you think of kids as they come into the world, assuming they're breastfed, their first exposure to prebiotic soluble fiber is mother's milk. Mother's milk is rich in prebiotic soluble fiber, and its only function is to feed the healthful bacteria in the colon to allow the infant to develop good populations of good bacteria. In fact, those prebiotic soluble molecules in mother's milk are not digestible by the child. So that literally, they're not food for the kid, they're food for the bacteria inside the kid. Make sure that he comes through the weaning process with an intact colon population that'll help him later in life. So that's the case during the first, call it 1 to 2 years, depending on how long a child is breastfed and then weaned. He subsequently weaned onto other foods. Those foods historically included plant-based fibers that had prebiotic molecules, things like onion and leek, shown in this picture. And then historically, it would also have included introduction of fermented foods, things like traditionally fermented sourdough bread and sauerkraut. Those fermented foods have a different type of prebiotic soluble fiber, and over the last 10,000 years, we've evolved to use both of these, both the plant-based prebiotic soluble fiber and the fermented prebiotic soluble fiber. Today, we still have a fair amount of vegetable matter in our diets, so there may be enough of the plant type getting into you, but unless you're eating several servings of fermented foods a day, the MIMO class of prebiotics is missing in the diet. Why is this important? A second reason, besides all the health effects that I explained earlier, there's been some recent evidence at Stanford and University of Michigan on what these bugs do if they don't get enough food. So specifically, bugs that like prebiotic soluble fiber have a preference for that fiber coming in the diet. And if the diet has an adequate amount, that's what they're going to eat. The bad news for us is if they don't get enough of that fiber, they then can turn to a secondary source of food, which is the mucus lining of the colon. So literally, if you're not feeding them, they begin to feed off of you. And this is research by Justin Sonnenberg out of Stanford, and was partially featured in a Scientific American article termed "Fiber Famished Gut Microbes Linked to Poor Health." So as the gut lining decreases in size, the mucus lining gets consumed by bacteria when you're not getting enough prebiotic soluble fiber. Simultaneously, those bacteria are no longer producing adequate amounts of short-chain fatty acids, which means that the gut lining cells are not being well fed, and the whole system starts to get leaky. And that's where the term leaky gut comes from. And leaky gut has been linked to most of the scourges of modern society, things like depression, anxiety, eczema, psoriasis, thyroid disease, colon diseases, colitis, and the like, autoimmune diseases, things like rheumatoid arthritis or fibromyalgia, colds and food sensitivities, allergies, all linked to the leaky gut caused by not enough prebiotic soluble fiber in the diet. As the gut leaks, the body will start to get bacteria and bacterial byproducts crossing the colonic membrane. So things that are supposed to stay inside the tube of the colon are now making it across the colon wall and getting exposed to the immune system. The immune system does what it's supposed to do. It says, ooh, foreign stuff, let's attack. So it releases a bunch of inflammatory cells. However, there's actually no infection necessarily going on, but you do end up with continual stimulation of the immune system and production of inflammatory byproducts. That first develops into local inflammation. If it goes on long enough, as these inflammatory byproducts get into the bloodstream, you get systemic inflammation, and over time it becomes chronic. And chronic inflammation has been linked to a whole host of different diseases: cancer, variety of cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, irritable bowel, inflammatory bowel, autoimmune disease, etc. Much the same linkage as with leaky gut. Not surprising, because leaky gut leads to this chronic inflammation. So let's segue into what you can do about it. So first, foods. Foods that are high in prebiotic soluble fiber are largely ones that grow mainly underground. So the ones I have pictured here is Jerusalem artichoke and onions, and then chicory and garlic and leeks. Those are relatively higher in prebiotic soluble fiber of the plant type. Other foods have some small amounts of prebiotic soluble fiber. Variety of whole grains do: beans, prunes, figs, sweet potatoes. So those are the basic food categories. You can also get prebiotic soluble fibers of the fermented type through fermentation. So if you're eating sauerkraut or kimchi, or you're fermenting your own vegetables, there are some small amounts of prebiotic soluble fiber that will get into your body through the diet. The take home is, it is possible to get adequate prebiotic soluble fiber purely through dietary means, but it's difficult. You'd have to eat several servings of both the food categories, that is the plant categories, and the fermented categories every day to do, that is to feed what your evolution has primed your bacteria to expect. Let's talk a little bit about foods and inflammation, and especially as we're approaching the holidays, things that you can prepare, things that you can cook. So if you go to the IsoThrive website, and the URLs are, the shortened URLs are on the screen, we have some recipes that are tasty. So the first one is crispy Jerusalem artichokes with aged balsamic, because it's made with Jerusalem artichokes, high in prebiotic plant-based fiber. Also Italian artichoke and leek salad, delicious. And again, because it has artichoke and leek in it, has a fair amount of prebiotic plant fiber. And staying away from items that are less helpful, things like mashed potatoes, which really don't have any prebiotics in them and are quickly digested and lead to a big glucose spike, or cream spinach. Spinach itself is great, not for its prebiotic content, but for its other vitamins and minerals. But then putting it in that cream-based makes it higher in calories and kind of dilutes the nutritional goodness. Likewise, you can use sweet potatoes and turn them into sweet potato pancakes, for instance, as a, if you will, substitute for the sweets in your diet. Things like, as we have pictured here, waffles with ice cream and chocolate sauce. And then tomato and onion salad. Again, another delicious one for people who are lovers of tomatoes, which I am one. And that might be a substitute for the many mayonnaise-based salads that typically show up on a holiday table. So the alternative to foods is prebiotic supplementation. It's the same concept as if you don't think you're getting enough calcium in your diet, you might take a calcium supplement, or you think you're not getting enough of vitamin D, you might take a vitamin D supplement. Prebiotic supplements have been around for a while, and the first generation all were made in kind of a bigger industrial type process. Their names are on screen: fructooligosaccharides, galacto-oligosaccharides, and galacto-oligosaccharides primarily show up in breast milk. Fructooligosaccharides are the type that come in plants that you may be getting enough if you're eating a fair amount of plants in your diet. Then there's some weirder ones. Xylo-oligosaccharides is one that doesn't really exist in nature to any large extent, something that's really created in the lab by scientists. So I think the judge is still out there. They haven't been around very long. I think of them as kind of a Frankenfiber. And then there's industrial isomalto-oligosaccharides, which are primarily digested and absorbed in the small intestine. So although there is some research on isomalto-oligosaccharides in terms of their prebiotic abilities, it comes with a big hit, big amount of glucose that's going to be absorbed, raising your blood sugar significantly. So my recommendation is definitely to stay away from those. Second generation prebiotic soluble fibers produced through natural fermentation And it's literally taking the same bacteria that's in fermented vegetables, isolating it, putting it in a sterile tank with the correct amount of nutrients that it needs to grow, and allowing it to produce prebiotic soluble fiber without the food. So it's sort of all the goodness of fermented foods without the foods. The one that's produced today is a maltoseel isomalto oligosaccharide. I won't say that twice. That's the scientific name. We call it NEMO for short, and this is the type that IsoThrive produces. So prebiotic soluble fiber, who benefits from it? Number one is almost everyone. As you could probably imagine, given prior slides, the health benefits are wide and broad, and therefore there really isn't anybody who couldn't potentially benefit from more prebiotic soluble fiber in their diet. Specifically, though, people with digestive issues like constipation and diarrhea, really good. If you're overweight, trying to lose weight. If you have a condition that's characterized by chronic inflammation, like metabolic syndrome or diabetes, coronary artery disease, inflammatory arthritis, inflammatory bowel, allergies, if you have high cholesterol or triglycerides, if you have brittle bones, what a doctor would call osteopenia or osteoporosis, and before and after antibiotic use, before to build up the healthful bacteria before the onslaught of the antibiotics, and then after to try and help those healthful bacteria repopulate your colon and keep out the bad guys. So some comments about staying healthy through the holidays. Besides the dietary recommendations that I just mentioned, sleep is important. We don't talk about it enough. You should get 8 hours or more a night. You probably don't need 12 hours a night, but trying to live on 5 hours is detrimental to your health. Second, exercise. Exercise has lots and lots of health properties. If you take all the literature on exercise together, it would about equal almost all of the health benefits that you can get out of pharmaceuticals, and it's free. So something as simple as a walk helps the food move around and also gets your heart beating, and some evidence that it decreases depression. So if you're feeling blue, get out and take a walk. Treats. During the holidays, they're all over the place. If you work, they're all over the workplace. Cupcakes, cookies, chocolates, etc. Try and keep them to one treat per week, not per holiday event. So if you have multiple Christmas parties and they're all in the same week, limit the amount of sweets that you're getting. Goes without saying, drink in moderation. The 90-10 rule is a way to think about your plate. About 90% of the room on your plate should be healthy stuff. So vegetables, fruits, protein, non-refined carbohydrates, things like whole grains, and only 10% or less should be less healthy things like dessert. A trick that I use that I pass on to you is, especially during the holidays when there's lots of dessert, lots of treats around, if you're going to consume one, cut it in half and only eat a half. That means you'll automatically, just through that one trick alone, cut down by 50% the amount of unhealthy type food you're getting into your body. I also added eating out. There's a fair amount of that during the holidays. Sometimes potluck, going to parties or other places, sometimes actually eating out at restaurants. But one of my tricks is, especially when eating at restaurants where food portions continue to grow, take half your meal, move it to the other side of the plate, and then eat just one half. Take the rest home in a doggy bag so that you have lunch tomorrow. So that pretty much concludes the talk. We've covered the difference between probiotics and prebiotics, how gut bacteria regulate the health. I hope I've made some of those topics clear. We've talked about food and inflammation and staying healthy through the holidays. And that completes my presentation. If you have questions, there is the opportunity to submit them to the staff, and they will then forward them on to me. So I'm going to wait for a couple of minutes in case I see any questions show up.
Great. A question came in about how do prebiotics support or help with osteoporosis and osteopenia?
Yeah. calcium absorption and magnesium absorption, but primarily calcium, are an integral part of the bone-making process. If you're not absorbing adequate calcium, then the osteoclasts, the bone-making cells, don't have the primary building block, calcium, to produce hard bones. Prebiotic soluble fiber, through its stimulation of both growth and metabolic activity of bacteria in the colon, leads to greater calcium absorption. So it provides more of the building blocks necessary by the cells that build bone.
Thank you. Another question has come in. Do you have any tips for bloating?
Yes, bloating. My primary tip for bloating is two things. One is staying away from refined carbohydrates, which tend to be bloating for a lot of people, but even more importantly, adding fermented prebiotic soluble fiber, either in the form of fermented foods or fermented supplements, prebiotic supplements like IsoThrive. The reason being that type in particular has been shown to actually decrease gas and bloating. Other prebiotics, all the first generation prebiotics, if you suffer from bloating, I'd stay away from those because they've all been linked to increased gas, abdominal pain, and bloating. Fermented prebiotic soluble fiber is the only one that's been linked to the opposite.
We have a couple more questions. We have one audience member who's asked, would you please point to definitive clinical studies that prove the concept of leaky gut?
Definitive. We could go round and round on what's definitive. I think there's lots of studies that support the concept of leaky gut, and it's becoming more and more accepted in the medical community. But as you can probably guess, different doctors believe different things, different scientists believe different things, and it takes a long time and a lot of evidence before everybody agrees on everything. If you think of the areas in science that you know about, climate change, for instance, lots of controversy, even though there's lots of evidence for a wide variety of scientific areas. So, in my opinion, there is authoritative evidence, and if you go to our website, there's a tab at the top that you can click on that'll get you to the nerd page. The nerd page is a page I put together that goes through a great deal of the scientific evidence for everything I just discussed.
That tab is under more information, by the way. And another question says, is there timing involved with when to take calcium supplements with respect to when one also takes a prebiotic?
Not really. The digestive process takes time. So if you take a calcium supplement or you take a prebiotic supplement or you eat prebiotic foods, they're going to be in your system for hours to days before they finally are eliminated out the bottom of the colon, so to speak. So there's going to be plenty of time for the calcium that you take in the morning to interact with the prebiotic soluble fiber stimulation of healthful bacteria that you take in the evening over the course of many, many hours to many, many days. So the timing is really not that important. You can take them together, you can take them apart. It really doesn't matter. Again, part of the reason for that is, remember, prebiotic soluble fiber, you do not digest. You do not absorb it. It's only food for the healthful bacteria in the colon. So as long as everything's arriving in the colon, which, as I mentioned, takes minimum hours and oftentimes days, it's got plenty of time to mix together and be in the right place at the right time.
So it looks like that's all the questions we have at this point, unless anybody has any additional questions they'd like to ask.
I think there was one other question I see posted here in terms of the slides for the presentation. Will they be available? And we'll actually send a recording of the entire presentation to people who are attending on this call. So you can expect that come in an email.
And we have a thank you from one of our attendees. So
Wonderful.
Thank you for participating.
I hope everybody has found it helpful. It's an area I'm passionate about for obvious reasons. I think it's the area, it's the next area beyond probiotics that can have the greatest impact on health compared to almost anything else you can do. The only one that, the only thing you could do for yourself that might equal prebiotic soluble fiber is exercise. Lots of evidence that exercise is good for you too, and preferably both. Get some exercise in your life 3 or 4 times a week and increase your intake of prebiotic soluble fiber. And with that last comment, I will end my presentation.